could play that role. I'm Rusty Reno, and I'm the editor of First Things magazine, and it's a real pleasure to be able to sit down with Patrick Deneen, who needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He's a professor of political science, political theory at Notre Dame University, and before that at Georgetown University, and before that at Princeton University, where I remember having lunch with him, gosh, in 2006, or was that even in 1999? 2006.
Probably 99.
99. And he's the author of Why Liberalism Failed, recent book Regime Change, that have really set the parameters for debate in our country about the future of our political system, the future of our national politics. I'm very jealous of the fact that a former president of the United States tweeted his appreciative comments about regime change.
Why liberalism failed.
Why liberal? Yeah, not regime change. So, anyway,
I'd be in trouble if that got tweeted, because I suspect I know who would tweet it.
Right. Right. So I thought we'd sit down and just talk about some issues broadly. And Patrick said, "Oh, Rusty, you're not the one that gets to ask all the questions. I get to ask questions too." So I certainly give him permission to do so. So I'm going to start with the atmosphere of discontent with the status quo, and get your impressions. You know, why liberalism failed really resonated. Why do you think, why are people eager to think about alternatives to the present system?
Yeah, so first, thank you for the invitation to be with you here. Thanks for coming out on a beautiful night in Chicago. Clearly nicer things to do here than this, but we'll try to make it at least serious enough to justify missing this beautiful weather. I was as surprised as anyone by the way in which that book, published in 2018, Why Liberalism Failed, the way that book kind of took off. I compare it to the feeling when I was a kid of getting caught in a wave. I grew up outside of Hartford, Connecticut. We'd go down to the beaches in Rhode Island, and when you're a kid and you get caught by a wave, you would just kind of trust that eventually it would tumble you in and you'd eventually reach shore. And that's how I felt during that roughly 2 years after that book came out in 2018. It wasn't written after the Trump election or after Brexit. It was written before that, effectively. It takes long enough for the book to come out. So it came out at a moment when everyone, I think, across the political spectrum sort of saw the system was in crisis. And it didn't matter whether one thought the system was in crisis and that was a good thing, or the system was in crisis and that was a terrible thing. Everyone was trying to figure out why it was in crisis. And it also felt like it wasn't just that one party or the other party was to blame. There was something systemically wrong. And so that, I think the book hit a moment, as sort of books that take off tend to do. It's not, you can't predict it. And I think the thing that struck a chord across the political spectrum was a sense of something had fundamentally changed in America. Now, whether you're on the right or the left, one might think that you might have a different view on that. But I think for those on the left, then as now, the sense that this was a country where one could succeed economically had really, I think, through a set of crises and then kind of systemic equalities, the crisis of the financial meltdown, that the left had really, really believed that no longer could the sort of left liberalism, the kind of FDR project, that didn't seem to be working anymore. And of course, I think, probably anticipating this audience, many on the right believed that the old assumptions of the kind of civic health, broadly speaking, of America had completely broken down. And that whether you were on the left and the right, something in the system itself seemed to be undermining one's belief in the American system or the liberal order itself.
Yeah, I think in my circles, Obergefell was in the court decision that, found a right to gay marriage, that really was kind of like a blow. It's like, what? How did something that, the president had pronounced himself opposed to in 2008, in 2012 too, suddenly became the law of the land? And I think that for many of us, that was like, well, wait a minute, this is much more degraded, much more far advanced than we had thought.
So some of you may have seen the survey that came out about a year ago, March of 2023, in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm still thinking about this survey. It's a survey of Americans, which asks them what things in their life, what values in their life do they treasure or value the most, are most important to them. And if you don't mind, I jotted these down because I'm a political scientist who can never remember numbers. They did this same survey 25 years before 23. So in 1998, these were the results. In 1998, 70% of respondents said patriotism was the most important value. 62% religion was among the most important values. 59% said having children, family, were the most important values. Dropping below 50, community came in at 47%, and money came in last at 31%, the most important values. That was in 1998. Now, in 1998, I was alive, you were alive, a lot of you were alive. We thought things were in really bad shape in 1998, right? Things were really trending in bad
Monica
ways.
Lewinsky.
Right. Here's the results in 2023, the same exact survey. And I'm going to read them in the reverse order. So, fifth place. So I gave you the 1 to 5. Fifth place, community, 27%. That's a loss of 20 points. Fourth place, having children, family, came in at 30%. That's a loss of 29 points. Third place, patriotism, 38%. That's a drop of 32 percentage points. Second place, religion, came in at 39%. That's a drop of 23 percentage points. And first place, money, which was in last, came in at 43%, still below 50%, interestingly, but that's the only one that rose by 12 percentage points. We've undergone a revolution in 25 years. If that's not a revolution, I'm not sure what. So Obergefell may have been a kind of punctuation on the revolution, but I think if you look at these trend lines, what makes a civilization robust and healthy, I would say it more or less tracks when we value the right things, which include things like family, religion, nation, community. Then you can say your civilization is probably reasonably healthy. But where all of those have dropped well below 50% and the only one that's risen is money, we're in trouble.
What do you think's driving? I mean, I look at education, so-called critical thinking amounts to showing how seemingly noble things are really base and oppressive. So it's not surprising then that young people would increasingly distrust the old wisdom, and they're cast upon, the consumer culture that's the default for us as a society. Any other thoughts on what the drivers are of this revolution?
So your question, I think, does point to certainly what one culprit would be, which is a kind of, I think, a change in the values among elites, what we call elites today, college-educated, people who run institutions, people who, program media, the kinds of programs that get, sort of suffused in our broadly what we call a culture, the kinds of values that get inculcated in colleges and universities. That's one culprit, but it's interesting that we can't go through this conversation without mentioning Christopher Lasch probably, but Christopher Lasch in 1995, so 3 years before the better version of this survey, in my view, published a book called The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, in which he lays out this charge that the elites then, in the late 90s, no longer value these phenomena. They betrayed democracy because they're sort of rootless. They don't have commitments. They want to be commitment-free. They don't want to be trapped or bound by these kinds of institutions that demand loyalties and sacrifice and duties because of the demands of the economy that they have to be largely available for wherever they need to go and whatever they need to do, and also the kind of values that are inculcated in those elite institutions. But in 1995, he also writes, it's almost Orwell, different Orwell than 1984. It's Orwell in 1984 when he says, look to the proles. Look to the proletariat for where you can still see these kinds of more traditional values. This is in 1995, and he says, the kind of proletariat, the working class, these are the people who still exemplify these kinds of virtues of home, patriotism, community, and so forth. Well, look at those statistics now. Look at where we are now, and I would have to say that, in fact, if we follow people like Charles Murray and his arguments from his book Coming Apart, you would find, in fact, that the working class is worse off than the elites, at least in terms of their condition, in almost every one of these measures, than those who are college educated, getting married, having children, having stable homes and communities and so forth. Perhaps they're more patriotic still, but in general, they are suffering from a kind of dissolution of social forms. In this situation, then, I think it's quite understandable why money becomes so important, right? Where you have the breakdown of institutions, and that can sort of shore up a human life, then money becomes your only recourse.
The narcosis of consumption, and then the desire to protect yourself, indemnify yourself against the challenges of life. Yeah, I think the money becomes all powerful. Part of the thing is that, as Lasch, I think, recognized, or didn't recognize at that point, is that the top 20% talks the talk of the 60s, but it walks the walk of the 50s. And so it, if you will, degrades social capital while still having the resources to act in these more traditional, things that are more conducive for human flourishing, abandoning their duty to renew and reinforce social norms. And as a result, as my image is, you take the guardrails off the windy mountain road, and if you're driving a Ferrari, you can zip along. But if you got an old jalopy and, with bald tires, you slide off the road into the abyss. And, whether it's deaths by despair, 100,000 people dying a year of fentanyl, or, rising illegitimacy nearly 50% or more for high school educated women, you see a lot of people are careening off the road. Yeah,
if I may then, so to get back to your previous question, what are the sources of this? If Lasch then predicted, or in 1995 argued that the problem lies with the elites and the solution lies with the proletariat, we're in a different place today. And I think this is, again, another way in which, and reason for which that book that we were just talking about, Why Liberalism Failed, it appealed to both the left and the right, but it took me a little while to realize this. It depended which half of the book they liked and which half of the book they didn't. And this is why Barack Obama liked part of the book. Right. And Archbishop Chaput liked probably the other part of the book, and maybe vice versa. In that book, I talk about liberalism not as, I hope many of you are aware of this, but I'll just state it. I'm defining liberalism not as the left side of the political spectrum, the way that talk radio would typically talk about the liberals, meaning progressives. I really talk about liberalism as a political philosophy that spans several hundred years in its development and includes both what we would today probably call conservatives or classical liberals, right liberals, which, again, oddly in the United States, we're, I think, one of the only countries that call this conservative. In most other countries in the world, this is called liberal, but we call it conservative. and as well as progressivism, which is a later development within liberalism, but in which I argue that both of these forms of liberalism share a commitment to the liberation of the human being from what are seen as arbitrary forms of identity or commitment or duty or requirements to act on behalf of. Who you are, it has to be defined, and your situation, where you live, what you do, the country you live in, all of these need to be defined by consent. That's the only way in which those things are legitimate. And the real difference lies in that the right sees this as a kind of, ideally achieved through a form of negative liberty. So reduce the state to the greatest extent possible, allow for the expression of individual liberty, where the left largely sees it essential that the state plays a role in equalizing our possibility to achieve this condition of freedom, of this form of more positive liberty, which is created through the conditions, especially of a more interventionist state, redistribution, and so forth. The condition then in which we find ourselves, and that these statistics point to, is one in which in some ways you could say the two sides have kind of together created the condition of achieving its aim. At the aim of the liberated human being. These statistics I just read to you is the kind of goal of liberalism.
So we're suffering from the success of liberalism.
That's right, precisely. But this, in fact, precipitated a kind of crisis, which it turns out when you get to that point when you are free, almost entirely free from any kind of commitment and obligation and membership and belonging in family and community and religion and nation, it turns out you're on your own. And as you're just describing, if you have the money to sort of create the kind of replacements for those forms of membership, you can navigate that road. If you don't have the money, you've taken what used to be in some ways a kind of public utility of membership and belonging and privatized it. And I think that expresses a lot of what I think is the kind of political discontents that we especially see arising from the kind of working class of our country, which notice is neither easily identifiable as left or right. Right? Economically, they tend to be more on the left because they see the outsourcing of their jobs and the kind of globalized capital as a threat. And they're also kind of more, at least in some respects, on the right. If we think about issues on the border and issues on certain kinds of the outer edges of the sexual revolution, transgenderism and CRT and so forth, I think the condition in which, in a way, that liberalism, if this is the kind of end station of liberalism, has generated this kind of political pushback that when that book hit, it was like, okay, this begins at least to explain it. I may not like it. I may not like half of the explanation, but it offers some kind of an explanation.
I suppose liberalism, the promise, as I understand it, liberalism conceives of freedom as the highest good. So the less constrained we are, the better. So the promise of liberalism is that ever-expanding freedom will make you ever happier. And as I see it on the right, it's more economically inflected, and it gets conjugated, if you will. The greater economic freedom, the wealthier we will all be. Rising tide lifts all boats. And certainly when your book came out, people were vividly aware that the promises of the 1990s and the building out of the global capitalist system, it didn't work out that way. That promise didn't seem to be fulfilled for large swaths of Americans. And the same thing in the cultural realm. All the indicators for mental health for young people are really in the toilet. And, certainly part of it is the phone, but of course that is this great instrument of choice. I don't have to watch 3 channels on TV. I can watch anything I want. I can have any entertainment I can want. I can shop whenever I want, communicate whenever I want. But more broadly, I can choose if I'm a boy or a girl. And this kind of, it's abyss of choice. That seems to be, these broken promises seem to be fueling a lot of the dissatisfaction that courses through our society. What are you seeing? I see it. I mean, you interact with undergraduates and graduate students, but they are very, at least my limited engagement, they're very, whether on the left or right, they're actually quite hostile to the present system. Even though, and they often go to very fancy universities, it's rewarding them handsomely, but they seem to be very open to radical ideas. I mean, what are you seeing there? What do you think that foretells?
Well, so I would say Notre Dame is, it's an unusual elite school. It's, it's a Catholic university. I know some of you doubt that, but it is. At least pockets.
I appreciate the noble lie.
Yeah.
As do you.
It's not entirely a lie yet, but look, I came from Georgetown to Notre Dame. It's a more Catholic university. So I've been to the other side. I'm not going back. It's an elite school. It's highly selective. But all the schools that you mentioned where I taught, with Notre Dame being the most recent, these elite schools, I would say right now you have a kind of, I would say a very large number of students who are just desperate to know what hoops they have to jump through to be successful. They get into the school by jumping through the right hoops, and just tell me which hoops to jump through and I'll do whatever I have to do to jump through those hoops, including using a lot of AI in my papers right now. I spent the entire last part of my semester detecting AI, running papers through AI. It's going to be an immensely time-consuming part of my job going into the future. But they'll do what they need to do to jump through the hoops, and with the aim being to get as much economic security as possible. So again, pointing to those statistics, I don't want to be one of those people who's economically insecure because there's no safety net in our society. And that's the world they've grown up in. There's no safety net if you don't have money. So they're not stupid to want to make a lot of money, but they're wrong to think that's what's going to make them happy, of course. Mm-hmm. And probably just about anybody in the room could tell them this. But there's very little that the world is offering to them in terms of what will genuinely make them happy, at least that they're being told by the broader society. So in the absence of that, making money is the security net that they're seeking. And then there's the really thoughtful students who are trying to figure this out, not by simply jumping through the hoops. Now at Notre Dame, those tend to be, dare I say, those tend to be the much more traditional Catholic students who are really keenly, they are throwing themselves into their studies and well beyond their studies to try to figure out these questions. They're voraciously reading, they're reading First Things, they're reading anything that they can get their hands on to answer the question, how should I live my life? Yeah. Because they are not getting it from the broader culture. Mm-hmm. Of course, the church is able to provide some of that, but not the everyday church that they're encountering. They have to go deeper. They have to read the Guardinis and the John Paul II's and the encyclicals and so forth. They're just voraciously trying to figure this out.
But they go further in the sense that there are radical dissenters from modernity. Yes. Anti-modern, yes, from John Ruskin to figures more recent. So it's part of our tradition in the modern era to have people who say, we haven't, not only have we not gotten it right, we fundamentally went down the wrong path. Yes. I mean, what do you...
Yeah, so this, I think this is very much a part of this critique of modernity, which of course is a age-old tradition, as you point out, is it's very much present at the fingertips. I'm one of their favorite professors because I teach a lot of these kinds of classes on critiques of modernity, critiques of liberalism. At Notre Dame, it tends to be either a kind of, I'm not going to say these are either or, but there are some students who tend more toward the, let's say, more traditional liturgy as the way in which they are pushing back against modernity. And then there are others who tend to push more toward a kind of 19th century Catholic, more strenuous critique of liberalism,
Right.
demanding a more strenuous Catholic form of politics, the kind of counter-revolutionary, the encyclicals of Leo XIII, the kind of, again, the 19th century critique, so de Maistre, Bonald, and Bilot, some of these figures from the 19th century who offer them this critique of modernity and a corresponding argument for a kind of robustly Catholic form of politics. Now that's Notre Dame. I know from colleagues and friends who teach at Ivy League schools, there's that element as well. There's a Catholic element at all of these schools that is drawn to this critique of modernity. Harvard, Yale, Princeton has a very strong element. But it also has a kind of, you could say, the contrary, which is an attraction to a kind of neo-Nietzschean critique of especially the left and progressivism and, broadly speaking, aspects of modernity. This is Bronze Age mindset, those of you who are familiar with this figure, especially young men, but not only young men, who see themselves as sort of dominated and tyrannized by this kind of female HR class that binds their lives to these little rules and disallows them from thinking and feeling and acting as men. So they're really drawn to this kind of Nietzschean call to freedom and openness and strength and weightlifting and eating raw eggs.
Right. In what sense is that really post-liberal and not hyper-liberal?
So this was I have to say, I assigned some of these texts in a class I just taught on critiques of modernity, and I think we all came away, myself and the students in the class, thinking this is sort of hyper-liberalism. It's a call for a kind of extreme form of freedom and human greatness that allows for the natural hierarchy of human beings to emerge. Now, that seems at one level to be contrary to liberalism, because liberalism doesn't presume there's a natural hierarchy. At another level, a core aspect, certainly of classical liberalism, is that our natural abilities should emerge. Now, they emerge in the marketplace, in the classical liberal understanding, but there's a fine line between the greatness of the individual emerging in the marketplace and the greatness of the individual emerging just in the social sphere, in the social domain. So there's a kind of a reason why, like people like Peter Thiel, for example, are drawn to some of these kinds of arguments. The kind of, cowboy capitalist entrepreneur who breaks the kind of rules of that you're supposed to follow and invents new things. This is appealing to that kind of capitalist who also finds the arguments for a genuine kind of liberation to be appealing.
Authority. Authority is the engine of constraint. Unchosen, imposed but not chosen obligations. We don't really have a party of authority in America. To your point about American left, American right, where Europeans historically have had parties of authority. Is it possible to have a party of authority, and what would that look like?
The problem in a liberal society, I think, as you rightly point out, is that authority already sounds illegitimate.
Yep.
The very word sounds illegitimate, because authority now has it sounds like something arbitrary. It sounds like a claim to rule, a claim to a position that's based on nothing more than an arbitrary attribution. And this goes all the way back to arguments of John Locke and critiques of here's your political theory 101 or maybe 102 exam. Who was John Locke critiquing in the first treatise of government? He was critiquing Robert Filmer, who wrote a text called Patriarcha.
Tracing government back to Adam's headship over Eve.
Right. And to patriarchy, and to his position as a father. So by linking political authority to fatherhood, Filmer opened up this kind of just gigantic opening for Locke to say, well, isn't the authority of any political figure the same as the authority of a parent, which is arbitrary? sorry, we don't get to choose our parent. How many times do you say, at what age did you say that? I wish I'd never been born to you. Right? That's the moment that's your Lockean moment when your kid says that, or you said that, if you remember saying that. I didn't ask to be born to you. And so Locke's point is that any political authority is essentially has that kind of arbitrary feature if it's not chosen.
Right.
Now, to be chosen becomes itself problematic, because in what condition can we be said to be actual free choosers? Right? How can we know that we're freely choosing what we think we're freely choosing? And this is where you go from Locke to John Stuart Mill. So the progression from Locke argues we are in a legitimate political order if we are the choosers. And Mill argues we cannot be legitimately the choosers until we're free of all of the social conformity that surrounds us. So we might live in a politically free country with lots of rights, lots of rights of free speech and free expression and inquiry. But if you can't actually use those rights, if you actually can't employ those because you're surrounded by the conformity of tradition, he calls it the despotism of custom. If you're surrounded by the despotism of custom that shapes your choices, then you're not actually freely choosing and freely consenting. And this is really the radicalness of Mill's argument, who's often regarded as the great classical liberal defender of freedom. His is actually an argument that in order to be genuinely free, you have to get rid of, to the greatest extent possible, the despotism of custom. Well, what is that?
Society.
I point to this list. Family,
religion.
Community, religion, God, country. Those are all sources of social conformity. And so, again, I think you can say that this survey, in a way, is a kind of, the outworking of the kind of logic that you see articulated first by Locke and then, I think, further articulated and defended by Mill, who, it's interesting that Mill is the figure that's most cited by Herbert Marcuse in a very important essay that Marcuse wrote called Repressive Toleration. And if you want to know the roots of the cancel culture on college campuses today, read Marcuse's essay, Repressive Toleration, about 12 pages long. And it's a defense of why it's necessary and justified not to allow conservatives, he's quite clear, people on the right, to speak because they represent the despotism of custom.
Right.
And he quotes Mill in several spots in which Mill says, liberty ultimately cannot be extended to those who would want to extend the despotism of custom.
Authority is the enemy of freedom.
Precisely.
Society is the source of oppression. It's not very far from those claims to where we are now.
You absolutely can trace it right back.
Well, what about America? I mean, clearly, live free or die, don't tread on me. Freedom, wow, it's really the great American word. Are we kind of doomed to live out the unfortunate logic of the Locke-Mill dynamic?
Well, if people don't listen to me, we are. I love to point students to the very opening chapters of Democracy in America. I'm required to mention Christopher Lasch and Tocqueville as part of my contract. The opening chapters of Democracy in America are always a bit shocking to the reader who's not anticipating. Tocqueville describes the kind of origins of democracy. He's explaining this to his French audience. And when he speaks of the origins of American democracy, he doesn't begin with the Constitution or even the Declaration. To the shock and scandal of the Jaffaites, the West Coast Straussians, he doesn't even mention the Declaration of Independence once in Democracy in America. So it's shocking. But what he does mention in the opening chapters of Democracy in America are the Puritans. And he mentions the Puritans as being the source of what he sees as the salutary and praiseworthy exemplification of democracy, which warms the cockles of my New England heart, born and raised in Windsor, Connecticut, which he sees in township democracy. He calls them the cradles or the schoolhouses of politics. that this is where people learn the art of essentially of ruling and being ruled, the art of citizenship. And he says the origins of this understanding of democracy come from the Puritans who founded the New England states. And he points to a passage, which is a passage from John Winthrop, known to you as the City on the Hill guy, from, well, actually Matthew originally, but Ronald Reagan picked it up from Winthrop. When he quotes Winthrop defining liberty. He says, Winthrop defines liberty in a way that would be familiar to any good Christian Catholic in the room. Liberty is not to be confused with license. Right? There's a form of liberty which is the belief that we should be unshackled and do as we wish. But this is a base form of liberty that contradicts authority. It cannot coexist with the idea of authority. But there is a higher form of liberty in which we are ruled and we are governed, ultimately governed by on high, but also governing ourselves. And it is by this form of rule that all forms of good society flow. So what we don't lack is a commitment to liberty. We lack a commitment to right liberty. I would submit that actually liberty is a word that we find throughout the American tradition. But in the earliest part of the American tradition, when everyone was reading the Bible and going to church, their various churches, this was the form of liberty. When they heard the word, that's the form of liberty that they were hearing. That's the form of liberty that they understood most deeply. The development of the Lockean form was one in which kind of gradually replaces. Mm-hmm. It begins to replace that older form of liberty. So it was a kind of gradual thing, and it didn't necessarily have to happen that way. Lots of things had to happen. But I would say that once you sort of reach a tipping point, and we could debate when that happened, but once you reach a tipping point, then the kind of this, what Winthrop would have called this debased form of liberty or license, crowds out that ancient form.
Well, even the debased form, it's a paradox of our time that we have license to an unprecedented degree, yet most people feel themselves in terrible condition of bondage. I'm young people. I'm a baby boomer. If you're young, don't boo. And I always tell the young people in my office, hedonism is not caring about tomorrow. I don't know any young people that are hedonists. They're deeply anxious about tomorrow and the future and getting all their ducks in a row and getting the right grades and internships and so on. And so people feel, we live in a triumph of Locke and a failure at the same time.
Which, I think this gets us back to where in some ways we started, which is that anxiety is born of a world in which you're on your own. Mm-hmm. You're on your own. And it is, in some ways you could say it's a condition of thoroughgoing freedom, but one that's in many ways unbearable. It's unbearable for the human being to be in that condition. And why it is then that we're sort of gnawed away. It's fascinating. This is the psychology that Hobbes describes. Right? At the beginning of the Leviathan, he describes the human psychology as this. It's not hedonism; it's constant anxiety. That the condition in the state of nature, right, which is the condition of freedom or license, the condition of complete freedom, is one in which we are constantly racked by anxiety. He compares it to the feeling of being Prometheus chained to the Caucasus Mountains and having your liver gnawed at every day, and then having it grow back, and the eagle returns and gnaws it out the next day. So what is really striking to me is that if we want to say that we're living increasingly in the realization of liberalism, the realization of liberalism is the realization of what for Hobbes was a kind of fictional condition that described human beings in this, again, a kind of a thought experiment, which we have made real. That's where we are now.
So he's the better psychologist of freedom. than
of that freedom.
of
That
license.
freedom. Yeah, of that freedom.
Of
Yes.
constraint.
Which he thought was the only real freedom. And the only antidote to that
Mm-hmm.
was to have a Leviathan, was to have the ruler who would provide for us security. Right. So in some ways,
The ruler brings our anxiety into focus as fear of him.
well, we fear him, but we also recognize that he assuages a lot of other fears. Right. We rightly fear him or respect him. We're in awe of him. He calls him a mortal god. So it's a new deity that we make, but he relieves us of the anxiety. And in this way, if you look at where many young people are today, they would like it if the state was just taking care of them.
Right.
Or
the teacher, just tell me
without any of these forms of human community.
Right.
Well, what can take care of us? Well, increasingly the state can take care of us.
Or the professor, just tell me what I need to do. And that is a kind of appeal. Please be a Leviathan, at least in this small moment, and alleviate my anxiety.
So, this is where I find myself now at odds with many of my friends on the right, former friends in some cases, which is sort of what is to be done moment. And given the decimation of all of these kinds of human associations that I began by describing where we are, how we value them, as Tocqueville or as Hobbes understood, in the absence of those forms of membership, which are forms of membership that entail authority and duty and sacrifice and restrict our license, restrict our ability to think of ourselves as completely free, that condition is not the state of nature, or if it is, it's the state of nature in which we quickly want to have a Leviathan. We quickly want to have somebody who's going to take care of us. So in other words, that in the absence of these kinds of commitments and robust institutions, as Tocqueville again predicts, we will turn to this entity, which becomes as he puts it, of course, the nanny state. I think the right, the kind of what a consistent view on the political right for a long time has been essentially to be laissez-faire economically and laissez-faire socially, which is to say, if we lift the oppression of the government on both the economy and the social sphere, the economy will be successful and the social sphere will be successful. And I am not at all persuaded, in fact, I'm very skeptical of both of these things, but it's my skepticism of the social sphere being healthy in the absence of some support and assistance of the public authority. And that can be at various levels. I'm a subsidiaryist. I believe in subsidiarity. So it may be local, it may be state, it may be federal. But I certainly think that our young people need help. And they need help, especially when it comes to forming families, having kids, buying a house, starting a family. And if you want to have a conservative movement in America, you better have parents, you better have families, because that's the only future that the conservative movement has. Right.
So I agree. I agree with you on both those counts. And I would even say that a kind of intelligently regulated free market is far more promising a future than a lightly regulated, if you will, cultural market, so to speak. It strikes me that your book, Regime Change, I am persuaded that it's a job of those who lead to be voices of authority. I mean, that's what you do. You run an institution, you're a voice of authority. And so we're really only going to get out of this dead end if we have an elite willing to assume that responsibility. I think a university situation with protests and all that just sort of anguishes me. Why can't these university presidents exercise the authority of the adults and say, this is not a permitted form of protest. You have to clear the tents. It would be very salutary. This is an educational institution, not a political forum. Whatever your way of thinking about those sorts of things. So I think you're right there. That you have to have It's a traditional role of elites to be the voices, if you will, of the authority of tradition, the authority of social norms. We're wearing our ties, right, which is a thing that we do as a way of honoring our role, our position, our status, and living up to it, if you will. I mean, your book argues that, and I'm sympathetic with this too, we have to appeal to the better angels of our nature, elite nature, and they have to be awakened to the cost of the cultural project that they have signed on to for ordinary people. And you believe that it's kind of a very optimistic, non-Machiavellian, I might add, optimistic, and I think not unwarranted optimistic view of a possibility. I've rambled on a bit. I don't know what you add to that.
I'd let no one ever accuse me of being optimistic. Hopeful, maybe. But it's interesting you phrase it, of course, you use the Lincoln line, the better angels of our nature. And the example of angels is a very good one, because the angels, of course, it's a hierarchy, right? They're governed, and they have a hierarchy, right? There are levels, right? It's like an army. The angels are an army, and you've got the various ranks of the angels, the seraphim and the cherubim and all the various, the archangels, the generals, and so forth. When our country was founded, and one of the most resonant and striking lines occurs in the Federalist Papers in, oh gosh, I should know which one it is. 51, I think it's 51, in which Madison writes that government is necessary essentially because of our vicious side, not to make us good. And he writes that if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. Very famous line from the Federalist Papers. If all men were angels, no government would be necessary. Now, as a Catholic, and look, Madison was the first graduate student at Princeton studying Hebrew, so he should have known better. But this is a complete misreading of Scripture, it seems to me, which is that there absolutely is a government. That even the angels who are generally good, Lucifer being an exception in some of his confreres, but the angels, even the good angels, are in a hierarchy because they are governed. They have a government. There is a government. There is a leader. There's the guy in charge, right? The big guy. And then there's even gradations within the angels. But that line about the government not being necessary if men were angels, I think it's planted a seed in the American psyche, and especially as the conservative movement was developed in the midst of the Cold War, in the midst of confronting this utopian ideology of communism and the forebear of fascism. There was already a native tyrannophobia in America coming out of the Revolutionary War that's always been present. And the Cold War and the institution of conservatism really institutionalized that tyrannophobia, that any argument for the legitimate exercise of political authority and power was automatically suspect of essentially being a kind of, a recommendation or a proposal to tyranny. And it's kind of built into not only maybe the American psyche, but certainly the conservative movement. And I think it is really a betrayal, or let's say it's an overstatement, an extreme overstatement of what there is to be feared from government, because there's certainly something to be feared from tyranny. This is all throughout the tradition, our Western tradition. But the Western tradition certainly, in as much as it includes the Aristotelian tradition, the Catholic tradition, the Thomistic tradition, also argues for the rightful role and necessary role of political authority as essential to the formation of the good society, which includes the formation of good human beings. And I think maybe in some ways, Richard John Newhouse, the founder of this journal, First Things, talked about a Catholic moment. I think, in spite of the church's current condition, which is rather woeful, let's say, in present company accepted, this is the Catholic moment in which this country needs for us to teach and to remind our fellow countrymen of the appropriate and rightful role of authority in shaping a good society. That yes, we need to be aware of and concerned with and suspicious toward the exercise of unjust political power. But the absence of political power also leads to injustice, as we've seen.
Yes.
The absence of political power, at least good political power, is also unjust. So the essential question becomes, what is the just exercise of political power? And I would begin with this list that I rattled off here. In what ways can political authority be used at various levels to help shore up? Let's, do the list. Nation, community, family, right? Community, God.
Right.
And maybe reduce the importance of money.
The founder of the magazine was very explicit. I remember once in a meeting saying, "Oh, Richard, you really are a liberal at the end of the day, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I'm a conservative liberal." And I've thought about it, and I've realized that I'm a liberal conservative. That is to say, a liberal application of authority is, in other words, the liberalism tempers perhaps the excess of exercise of authority rather than for the conservative liberal, the prejudice against authority takes primacy except in situations where it's necessary. I'm not sure that distinction has a whole lot, but there is a difference in sentiment. Or I guess it's a difference in terms of what is the greatest threat to human happiness in our time. Is it the overbearing power of the state, or I remember being with my mother and she was listening to NPR, something to do with, I can't remember what it was, and she said, "We live in such a puritanical society." And I said, "Mom, you are out of your mind. We live in a society where there's almost no limits on people's appetites and desires. And if you think that's the case, then the imperative is to renew authority. Whereas if you are, I think, of an older generation, you still think that the greatest threat is this overbearing middle-class bourgeois social consensus that it imposes a deadening conformity or a overbearing state that stifles creativity and initiative.
So there are probably some people. So first of all, the most interesting thing we found out tonight is your mom listens to NPR. So that's really interesting.
That was 20 years ago.
Okay, yeah, I did too 20 years ago. There are doubtless some people listening who are thinking the problem is government. There is too much government. There's too much authority. There's too much exercise. We need to cut back on government. But I guess I would let's think about for a second what's being conceded if that's one's view. What's being conceded, and we'll actually bring back Obergefell as well, what's being conceded is that we might disagree with the way government power is being exercised. In the case of Obergefell, right, institutionalizing gay marriage, we might regard various of its actions, the kind of DEI ventures, the way in which that's filtered into all aspects of life, various ways that certain views are funded and certain views are not funded. But that very argument kind of acknowledges, wow, it's really efficacious. Right. It works. You can actually shape the worldview of people in this country by the exercise of political authority. And in fact, if the argument is against political authority, we propose to do nothing, you're going to lose and you're going to keep losing. Expect to keep losing if that's your only argument. I really think that not only is, of course, political authority essential, but if you don't think and grapple with in what ways can and ought to be used, and again, at what levels is it appropriate to do so, given our particular situation, then you can expect the conservative movement to keep losing in all of the things that it cares most about. So there's a very interesting way in which there's a kind of underlying recognition of the efficacy of political power. I'll give you one other example of this. Conservatives hate government except for the military. We think our military is great, at least until about 3 years ago. And it's great because it has great people working for it. They care about this country. They sacrifice everything for this country. I've known a lot of young soldiers in my classes. They're some of the greatest human beings I've met, wonderful students, amazing human beings. That's government. And they're doing something that's actually, at least until some recent years, has been among the most effective things that our country has ever done. Right? So I think we just, in many ways, again, as Catholics, coming from this tradition in which we do understand the role, the formative and moral nature of the law, that to begin to confront our own tyrannophobia, not to embrace the idea of tyranny,
Right.
to recognize that tyranny is the unjust exercise of political power. And of course, there are all kinds of forms of private tyranny as well, that sometimes you need public power to push back against private tyrannies, of which we have plentiful and manifold examples of. But to begin to push back against the kind of just raw tyrannophobia, to begin to exercise much more prudence and judgment about what are the ways that a conservative can begin to think about the positive role for political authority, to begin to, let's hope, claw back some of, and begin to rebuild some of the vital institutions that we're going to need if we don't want Leviathan.
Why don't we, before we turn to Q&A, just, I guess we can only vote for what we can imagine. So what do you want for your grandchildren? What's the America that you can imagine us using political power, legitimate authority to get to? Big question, I know.
It is. I mean, it's very simple in many ways. I mean, again, it would be going back to something closer to 1998 percentages and realization of the things that we value and the things that we feel that we would give our time, our commitment, our make sacrifices on behalf of. More of my students considering some form of public service rather than working for McKinsey coming out of college. I used to teach at Princeton. Outside of almost every dormitory at Princeton, almost every window has at least one star. It's a gold star that's on the ledge, and that's a star for a student who died in one of the wars that America fought in. And if we took away all the stars that were before or including Vietnam, there would be none left. There'd be very few at Princeton during Vietnam and none afterwards. In other words, students at those institutions no longer are serving in our military. So patriotism, how do we begin to rebuild patriotism? Family, if we could go back to what was the percentage, 70%, 68% valued having children, and that was plural. Having enough children that your child has a sibling and knows what that's like. Community, religion. I think if I could imagine my grandchildren grow up in a world in which those things were the most important things, and money was back around 31% of the very important values. I'm a real nostalgist going all the way back to 1998. But I think unless we can really move those, not just those statistics, but those commitments in a different direction, I think we're done for. I think it is, we could look to the way in which great nations or great political powers fell, and we could say that was a moment when when the United States, the people of the United States ceased to value these fundamental building blocks of civilization. Now, how we get there, that's a challenge. But I would say here, those who care about these things, which I would say is largely the conservatives, have to simply think long and hard, and I think begin to move toward a commitment to being willing to invoke authority and the various levers of our politics to reinforce commitment to these phenomena. These commitments don't occur in a sense naturally. They're learned, they're taught, they're conveyed, and it has to be through the entire system in a way to convey those things.
Well, thank you. Thanks for some great comments.